And your next witness?
Your Honor, the plaintiff's call, Professor Gary Segura. With the court's permission, we will be handing out a binder that has the main exhibits for direct testimony to the court and the witness.
Very well.
Your Honor, Mr. Cooper asked if we could just pause while Mr. Thompson is brought back into the courtroom.
That would be fine.
To be fair.
Absolutely. I think we can, however, do the formalities and swear the witness and get him ready to go.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. State your name, please,
Gary Segura,
and spell your last name,
Segura,
and your first name.
Gary, Gary.
Thank you.
Is Mr. Thompson back amongst us? Not yet? Well, why don't we just stand up and stretch a minute?
He's on his way presently.
Very well, Mr. Thompson, welcome back.
Thank you.
Are you organized now?
Yes, Your Honor.
Good, then we can begin. Mr. Boutros, you have a witness on the stand?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Professor Segura.
Good morning.
Could you tell the court a little bit about your academic and professional background?
I'm a professor of political science in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University. I received a PhD in political science in 1992 from the University of Illinois. I've taught at a variety of institutions and came to Stanford about a year ago, actually a year and a half ago. And I also, at Stanford, I serve as the chair on the program on Chicano Studies. And I'm currently president of the Midwest Political Science Association, which is the second largest professional association of political scientists in the United States.
And what is the Stanford Center for Democracy?
The Stanford Center of American Democracy is a newly established center at Stanford that I co-direct with another professor, designed to use empirical techniques to explore data about the American electorate and its implication for American democracy. Our biggest project is the American National Election Studies.
Well, what does the American National Election Studies entail, briefly?
Well, the American National Election Studies is the gold standard, as it were, of political science studies of the electorate. They are conducted every 4 years during an election year with some ancillary studies leading up to the election year. And it's been run consistently since 1948. So we have a very long portrait of what the American electorate thinks about politics. And my colleague and I just are now taking over the study.
Do you serve on any editorial boards or journals in your field of study?
I do. I'm currently on the editorial board of the AJPS, the American Journal of Political Science, American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics and Political Research Quarterly. I've previously served on the editorial board of PS, Political Science and Politics.
Could you describe, generally, the nature of your studies and research work and specialty?
I think of myself as a student of political representation. So my work is primarily political behavior, which is looking at the mass opinions and attitudes of actions of citizens in the society. As a representation theorist, what I try to look at is how things subsequently connect to the actions of policymakers, so that obviously representation has two ends to the relationship.
Well, maybe you could just briefly describe what it means to be a representation theorist.
So one of the vexing questions in political science from its earliest days is whether or not the democratic governance by elected official is in any way broadly responsive. And so there has been a debate off and on about whether or not the elected officials are responsive to changing views of the public, whether or not they are actually leading the public, that is, or the public is actually more responsive to elected officials. And so what I try to look at is the dynamics of how communication between elites and the mass public change how people view and how the elite act over time.
In your work, have you focused on the ability of minority groups to have their views heard and enacted into law?
Yes. I would say that while my program began as a sort of a broad understanding of political behavior and its effects, in the last decade and a half or so, I've tended to focus more exclusively on minorities. I've spent a lot of time looking at racial and ethnic minorities, and particularly Latinos.
In your work, have you focused at all on the rights of gay men and lesbians in terms of their activities in the political sphere?
I have.
And have you published any books in your career?
I have one co-authored book just out this month, and I have co-edited volume from several years ago.
And what is the name of the book that's just out this month?
Latino Lives in America.
And could you turn to Exhibit 2330, Plaintiff's Exhibit 2330, which is in the binder that you've been provided?
Yes,
What is that document?
it's my CV.
Does that include a summary of your professional background?
Yes,
Does that document also include a list of your publications?
yes.
Now, have you published any articles in peer-reviewed publications in your career?
Yes.
And can you give us an overview of the number and type of publications you've published?
So I have about 42 or so publications. So about 25 of those are peer-reviewed articles, meaning that it's an article-length document that's submitted for a peer review process and a journal that publishes a variety of different authors each issue. I also have about some number, 15 or so chapters in edited volumes, which means that I have submitted the article, but the article was grouped with several others and refereed in that manner.
Have you given any conference presentations where you lay out the results of your research work and theories?
Constantly.
Can you give us a ballpark figure over the last decade?
Ballpark, probably, I don't know, between 20 and 40. I present pretty constantly.
Thank you. And there's a list of examples contained in Exhibit 2330, your CV.
Okay. Yeah, I think I just put the last 10 years or so in.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Could you please describe your work on gay and lesbian politics and political issues?
I have 3 pieces published focusing specifically on gays and lesbians. One is a piece in an edited volume about the various aspects of gay and lesbians and their participation in the democratic process. And that piece is on how whether or not different electoral structures would favor or disfavor gays and lesbians, and focuses specifically on the city and county of San Francisco. The second is an article in a peer-reviewed journal called Rationality in Society, where I am a co-author that tried to model the self-identification and mobilization behavior of minorities who can pass as a member of the majority. That is, minorities whose identification as a minority is uncertain to the perceiving public. And then the third is an introduction to a symposium in PS. And it's a satirical piece in the wake of the 2004 election about the consequences of the 14 state ballot initiatives banning same-sex marriage in that year.
What is PS?
PS? PS is a journal that serves 2 purposes. It's published by the American Political Science Association. It serves both as a sort of topical journal, kind of events of the day and what political scientists take on those events would be, as well as things more suited to those who are functioning in the profession. Suggestions about teaching ideas or syllabus ideas, news within the profession, that. So it's both a newsletter for political scientists as well as a presentation of topical research.
In your classes at Stanford, do you teach any courses that focus on the participation of gay men and lesbians in the political process recently?
I've actually taught gay and lesbian politics for probably about a decade. But at Stanford, in the courses I teach on just broad questions of political behavior, and particularly in courses on minority politics, I always include a unit on gays and lesbians.
Your Honor, at this time, I would like to offer Plaintiff's Exhibit 23330 into evidence, as well as all the other exhibits in this binder. And I will present, with the court's permission, the clerk with a list. And I believe Mr. Thompson has agreed that there's no objections to this list or exhibits.
That's correct, Your Honor.
Very well, you are offering.
I'm offering all the documents that are on the list, this list. I can list them or provide it. Would you like an additional list into evidence?
No, let's let the document speak for itself.
Thank you, Your Honor. Happy to do that. Thank you, Your Honor. In connection with your work on this case, Perry versus Schwarzenegger, what issues were you asked to examine?
I was asked
You're
to
getting opinions
evaluate
now. Have
gays
you
and-
qualified?
Oh, yes, Your Honor. Why don't I just do that first? Your Honor, I tender Professor Segura as an expert on the subject of the political power or powerlessness of minority groups in the United States and of gay and lesbians in particular.
Mr. Thompson?
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Yes, well, I'll restate my question. What issues were you asked to examine in this case?
I was asked to examine gays and lesbians and their participation and their interest in the U.S. Political process, to determine whether or not I saw them as being powerful or powerless, and what evidence would be brought to bear to understand such a thing.
In conducting your analysis of your work in this case, what did you do to arrive at your conclusions? What type of information did you review? And what kind of things did you study?
Well, the first thing I did, I read. There's a growing literature on gay and lesbian politics, and so I went out and I found out what kind of what the state of that literature was. Many of the pieces I was very familiar with, some were new. The next thing I did was I tried to go through the statutory status of gays and lesbians, because it varies quite dramatically from state to state, in order to determine what I thought the circumstances of gays and lesbians were with respect to a statutory protection or statutory disadvantage in the states. I looked at public attitudes, including very recent data on public attitudes towards gays and lesbians. I examined the presence of absence of gays and lesbians in political office. And then I spent a lot of time looking at ballot initiatives, which are kind of the central question right now in gay and lesbian politics.
Well, in connection with your work, did you review and rely on the documents that are listed on the exhibit list contained in the binder, aside from your CV, which is PX 23330, informing your opinions in this case?
I did.
And did you also rely on your general knowledge and experience and work and reading through your career as a political scientist?
I did. When I went through and enumerated the things that I focused on, I realized just exactly how much I read, which would explain my eyesight. I started graduate school in 1985. So at this point, I've read thousands of journal articles and hundreds, if not more than 1,000 books. So, I've read a lot about politics in the United States. Many of these things informed my views, but the materials that I presented were the ones I focused on to make specific points in the arguments I was making.
Well, did you rely at all on a book by Robert Dahl in forming your opinion?
I did.
Dahl, D-A-H-L. And is that something you mentioned in your report and in your deposition in this case?
It is.
And that is not a document we've included in the exhibit list simply because of length, but is that a classic text in your field?
I would describe it as canonical. Everyone reads Dahl.
Well, in connection with your work, did you review the deposition testimony by Dr. Nathanson?
I did.
And did you today review the videotape clips that were played from Dr. Nathanson's deposition?
I did. I was in the overflow room.
And in connection with your work, did you prepare a rebuttal report to Dr. Nathanson's report when he put forth as an expert in this case by the proponents of Proposition 8?
I did, and I was deposed a second time on that.
And did you also review the expert report and deposition of Dr. Miller, one of the proponents of Proposition 8's experts in this case?
I did.
Did you attend Dr. Miller's deposition?
I did.
I'd like to publish demonstrative number 1 and ask you, Professor, to state briefly, with an overview, what opinions you've arrived at in this case based on your work.
So I want to offer 3, which I think speak to the questions that I was asked to consider. The first is that, in my view, when we consider the U.S. political system, gays and lesbians do not possess a meaningful degree of political power. They are not able to protect their basic interests and effectuate their interests into law and secure those. The second is that relative to some other groups that currently enjoy judicial protection, gays and lesbians are actually, in the statutory and constitutional sense, worse off than some of those groups were when they were granted judicial protection. And finally, I'm deeply troubled by some of the comments or some of the conclusions that Professor Miller drew in his rebuttal, and I find them unpersuasive.
Well, why don't we, as a prelude of getting to the details of your testimony, talk a little bit about what you mean when you talk about political power. How do you define that term for purposes of your analysis today?
For me, political power is the ability of an individual or group through mustering their own resources to achieve and secure the interests in the political system, and to do so relying primarily on themselves. That is, there has to be an exercise whereby their resources bring about the change that they're hoping to accomplish.
Is that a definition of political power that is consistent with generally accepted notions in the literature of political sciences?
I believe that is. And in fact, I think it's drawn directly from Robert Dahl's classic definition that A has power over B when A can get B to do something B otherwise wouldn't do. And there's a key element of that, which is that A is getting B to do something that B or may not be predisposed to, because that distinguishes political power from simple agreement. My current favorite example is, I happen to be a New Orleans Saints fan. There's a lot of other New Orleans Saints fans, but I don't have power over them. We just happen to agree.
And in your concept and definition of political power, how does the concept of pluralism in your democracy play out?
So there is a theory of American government that was put forward first by the founders, by Madison in the Federalist Papers, and then sort of reinvented in 20th century political thought, specifically in the person of Robert Dahl, that one of the biggest threats to society is faction. That is, if you have individuals who are able to secure and hold power over a long period of time without rotation in office, that they might conceivably tyrannize other parts of the society. And so for Madison, the solution to this was the extended republic. That in the extended republic there would be many interests, and as a consequence of the plurality of interests, none of them would be able to gain the upper hand for a long period of time, and that would mitigate the dangers of faction and the risk of tyranny. In the 20th century, political theorists have conceptualized that this as pluralism, the idea that there is an almost equilibrating system, there are groups and interests, and if they become too powerful, they disturb the interests of individuals who hold a different opinion, and they organize. And so it's almost Newtonian. To every action, there's a reaction. And this is supposed to prevent the accumulation of power by one group. But it presupposes that there's no such thing as a permanent majority. And it also presupposes that this system of contestation is fair. And one of the chief critics of pluralism, E.E. Schattschneider, has a very famous quote. And that quote is that the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a decidedly upper-class accent. That is, in this contestation between groups, it is people with resources that are more likely to achieve outcomes. And people with resources, no matter how dedicated, are going to be disadvantaged in that system.
Well, how does this concept of pluralism relate to the opinions you are giving here today regarding the power of powerlessness of gay men and lesbians in the United States?
I think that by any measure, gays and lesbians would have to be understood as a minority faction. In Madison's terms, that is, people who accept the normativity, if it were, of heterosexuality have held power essentially forever. So it is difficult with the resources that they have for gays and lesbians to press their cause in the political system. They just simply don't have the numbers and the resources to be effective advocates in a lot of political arenas.
Do the courts, does the judiciary play a role in pluralism, in the concept of pluralism that you've just described?
Well, the reason we frequently refer to our system of government as Madisonian, and we say this as a contradistinction of majoritarianism, because the founders specifically, the founders and also the proponents of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution specifically envisioned a set of constraints to sort of rein in majoritarian impulse. So it is certainly a society that responds to majority rule, but it's also a society where there are limitations on what the majority can do. The majority cannot gather together and vote to deny a whole group of people, say, the right to vote or some other basic right.
Now, when you talk about obtaining political favorable outcomes, is that in and of itself sufficient to determine whether a particular group has political power in our system?
Well, certainly. Favorable outcome is certainly a positive thing that I would want to consider. I would also want to know some circumstances of the favorable outcomes. Were they judicially triggered as opposed to legislative? Were they passed with bipartisan majorities or with slim majorities? What's the arena of contestation? Are we talking about a favorable outcome over some advantage that's being accrued to the group, or are we talking about a favorable outcome trying to ameliorate a severe disadvantage? So we would want to take into account the process whereby the outcome was achieved and the subject matter of the outcome before we conclude that the outcome by itself was sufficient evidence.
Well, can you give me an example of a favorable outcome that does not necessarily reflect the successful exertion of political power by gay men and lesbians?
There's a very good recent one. So there's been a lot of news recently about the newly elected mayor of Houston, who is a lesbian. And this was talked about extensively in the news media. You know, holy cow, there's a gay mayor of a major American city. I know a little bit about Houston politics and a little bit about Texas politics, particularly mayoral politics. And it turns out that the race that she was elected in, she was elected in pitted a white lesbian Democrat against an African American Democrat. Now, Houston is a city where there's been tremendous racial, ethnic divisions. There have been tremendous divisions over development. That's one of the key fracturing lines in Texas politics. Will the developers be allowed to do what they'd like to do, or should they be constrained? And so there's a fairly complex web of racial and economic and social partisan fracturing lines in Houston politics. That she was elected certainly is a positive element to consider for gay and lesbian political power. However, I have to look at the context, and that context suggests there was a lot else going on in that election. And just a few years back, Houston voters were actually asked to weigh in on the question of whether or not Houston cities employees can have same-sex domestic partner insurance benefits. And by a citywide plebiscite, they voted it down. So while there is now a lesbian mayor of Houston, her partner of 19 years cannot obtain health insurance through the city.
How about the recent signing into law by President Obama of hate crime legislation that includes hate crimes based on sexual orientation? Does it reflect political power?
I would say it reflects positively on gay and lesbian political power on one dimension and negatively on two. So the positive news out of the hate crimes legislation is that this is a 20-year priority for gay and lesbian activists, and it was achieved in November or October, I think, of this past fall. So that's clearly something that they were happy about. From the opposite side, I would consider both the context in which it was passed and the subject matter of contestation. So what we're looking at here is a piece of legislation that criminalizes bias-motivated attacks on gays and lesbians. So, we're not talking about, a huge victory that, creates, gay spots in a service academy or something like that. We're talking about sort of ameliorating a real serious element of disadvantage that gays and lesbians face in American society. The other thing is that in order to get it passed, it was attached as a rider to the Defense Authorization Bill. And it's a common practice in Congress to attach more controversial pieces of legislation to more consensual pieces of legislation to make it harder for people to vote against it. So it was attached to the Defense Authorization Bill. Even though it was attached to the Defense Bill, 75% of the Republicans in the United States Senate voted against it. They voted against the Defense Authorization Bill, which is not a customary Republican position in the Senate. So I think that we consider how the hate crime bill was passed and the fact that we're talking about criminalizing pretty vicious behavior that would weigh against a judgment for political power.
In analyzing the political power of a particular minority group, it is also appropriate to look at the vulnerability of favorable outcomes that have been achieved.
Well, I'm not sure it's necessarily the case in all circumstances, but it's certainly the case for gays and lesbians because of the role of ballot initiatives. So in a number of jurisdictions, most of the western part of the United States and parts of the East as well, laws passed by the legislator or laws passed by even city and county legislators are able to be overturned by popular plebiscites. Or there's a process where citizens can just have a law voted on through the initiative process. And initiatives have been used to roll back legislative gains by gays and lesbians over and over again. In fact, between 1990 and the middle part of the 2000s, there's been probably like 150, not even counting the same-sex marriage votes, there's been like 150 votes on gay and lesbian, usually on gay and lesbian anti-discrimination protections, and they lose about 70% of the time.
Now, when you're looking at political power on a particular issue, is it also a factor to that you consider the importance of the issue to the gay and lesbian community, or whether minority group or whatever minority group you're talking about? Is that another factor you apply when you're looking at favorable outcomes?
Well, sure. I think we would want to look at the subject matter of any piece of legislation. So, for example, in California, there's now a standard clause, a standard anti-discrimination clause that's attached to the end of many pieces of California legislation. And they might have to do with state licensing requirements on some profession or some type of business or whatever. And then at the end, they say, shall not be discriminatory. I wouldn't call that a victory for gay and lesbian rights, because it's not clear that gays and lesbians were, actively working for, rights in insulation contracting or, some other sort of licensing issue. We want to focus, when we want to focus on estimating political power, we want to focus on things that are important to the group whose power we are trying to assess.
Would marriage qualify as one of the salient, important issues that would serve as a marker?
Yes.
Speaking of markers, in your expert opinion, what are the markers of political powerlessness?
So there were two types of markers I talked about in my report. The first are sort of manifestations. Can we look at the results of power or powerlessness? And then the second were the causes or the factors that might contribute to those results.
Well, why don't we start with the manifestations of political powerlessness of gays and lesbians in the United States? Could you give us an example of one manifestation that supports your opinion regarding the powerlessness of gays and lesbians?
Sure. The first thing I would look at, excuse me, the first thing that I would look at is the absence of statutory protection or the presence of statutory disadvantage. So, if there are laws hurting you and there are no laws helping you, that would be evidence that you have a lack of power.
I would like to display demonstrative 3, which and ask you to comment a little bit about the absence of protections in the United States for gays and lesbians.
Okay.
And in fact, could you describe what this demonstrative 3 that we put up on the screen reflects?
Well, these are, this map displays the states that have statewide, some form of statewide protection for employment non-discrimination against gays and lesbians.
And how many states do not include protections based on sexual orientation against discrimination?
29.
You watched Dr. Nathanson's testimony this morning, correct?
I did.
And you heard him mention the Matthew Shepard case.
I did.
Which state was Matthew Shepard's? Where did that event regarding Matthew Shepard occur?
Wyoming.
And is Wyoming one of the states that has, since the event, enacted any kind of protection based on sexual orientation discrimination?
Wyoming has no protection. And this is a little bit off the topic, but Wyoming doesn't even have a hate crimes law.
In terms of the 10 largest states in the United States, how many of them have laws that provide protection against discrimination based on sexual orientation?
3.
Let's look at the federal system. Are there any statutory absences in the federal system that, to your mind, indicate, in your expert view, a lack of political power on the part of gay men and lesbians?
Yes. And I would say there are also statutory disadvantages at the federal level. So there is no federal level anti-discrimination protection for housing and employment. There's no federal level protection really on any level beyond the recently passed hate crimes bill. There is federal legislation prohibiting gays and lesbians from receiving partner benefits in federal employment as an incident of the Defense of Marriage Act. There is the exclusion of gays and lesbians from service in the military. And historically, at one point, gays and lesbians were completely forbidden from working for the federal government.
Well, how long ago was that?
I think that actually ended in the 1970s, but it started as far back as immediately in the post-war era, maybe President Eisenhower.
And in that regard, are you familiar with a man named Frank Kameny?
I am.
Can you tell us a little bit about Mr. Kameny's experience?
So, in the early days of homophile movement, the first pro-gay organization, and pro-gay is a strange way to describe this, but the first organization working to ameliorate the disadvantages faced by gays and lesbians was an organization called the Mattachine Society. And it started on the coast, particularly in Los Angeles and New York. This was in the early 1950s. And it then kind of fell on hard times, in part because they faced a lot of repression. In the 1960s, the Mattachine Society was revived in Washington, D.C., and Frank Kameny was essentially the principal organizer. And he took a much more proactive stand than the leaders of the Mattachine in Los Angeles and New York did. So Kameny regularly would send letters to the U.S. government demanding that the prohibitions on gay employment be dropped, or asking why there were these various obstacles to tax deductions or other benefits that other nonprofits enjoyed. So he was much more likely to engage the political system.
Was he employed by the federal government?
I believe he had been dismissed. I don't remember the exact circumstances of his participation.
Well, let me ask you this. In terms of protections, well, let me back up. In terms of statutory protections, does the fact that California includes a number of anti-discrimination provisions that apply to gay men and lesbians affect your view regarding the lack of political power of that group?
Well, it was certainly something I considered. The presence of statutory protections is preferable to the absence of statutory protections in evaluating power. That said, I would still want to look at the circumstances by which they were passed, the degree to which they are secure in the political system, and also the subject matter over which they are covered. So in some instances, in most of these instances, these are attempts to redress discrimination. So if we look at a hate crimes protection, or we look at anti-discrimination ordinance, the purpose of that is to ameliorate a disadvantage, ameliorate a wrong that exists. While it's certainly good to have that, it's difficult to conclude that there's a measure of political power in and of itself. I would be asking, I would be akin to saying that because you have more prescriptions, clearly you're healthier. No, you have prescriptions because there's a problem. And that same would be true here. We have anti-discrimination statutes because there's discrimination. The second thing I would want to look at is how those ordinances were passed. In some instances, some of the California ordinances were passed in the wake of court decisions ordering that policies be adopted. This is true for California's anti-development discrimination ordinance. And even though the courts have already held this, that political process was quite contested. For example, the first version placed the first attempt to codify this court decision placed gay and lesbian employment and housing protections in the Fair Employment and Housing Act of California, and that was vetoed by the governor. So when the decision was codified, It was codified in the labor code of the state, which has a shorter time period for complaint and a much more relaxed sort of regulatory mechanism. So there was quite a bit of opposition even to codifying a decision that had already been handed down by the courts. And of course, the minority, partly in this state, as part of its platform, made it clear that it would like to repeal all of those. So I'm not sure I would be certain that they're, permanent protection. Third concern I would raise would be that it's problematic to focus only on a single jurisdiction because a domestic partnership ordinance in California does not provide any protection for you if your partner becomes ill on a trip to Las Vegas or attending the Mardi Gras in New Orleans. That's when we look at, particularly when we look at Prop 8. These are national questions, that the politics of the proposition was national. The politics of most of the ballot initiatives on same-sex marriage and so on, even on anti-discrimination, involved activists on both sides from around the country. So I'm not sure I would conclude on the basis of some of the positive statutory outcomes, ameliorating some severe disadvantages, that alone constitutes political power.
Let me ask that demonstrative 2 that you prepared be displayed and ask you. This is a quote from Romer versus Evans. Perhaps you could read that so that it's into record. And then explain to me how that bears on your evaluation of California's protections against discrimination to the extent that they exist for gays and lesbians.
So I will preface it with there is a trope in the argument against protections for gays and lesbians that these are special rights that gays and lesbians don't need. And speaking specifically to that argument in Romer, Justice Kennedy writes, "We find nothing special in the protections Amendment 2 withholds. These are protections taken for granted by most people, either because they already have them or do not need them."
What protections had Amendment 2 withheld in Colorado?
Amendment 2 was a breathtaking piece of legislation. So at the time of several small cities, I believe it was like Aspen, Boulder, and Denver, that sounds right, had passed Denver, a big city obviously, had passed anti-discrimination ordinances. And so Colorado's Amendment 2 would have amended the Colorado Constitution to eliminate those local ordinances that were anti-discrimination ordinances. But it also would have prohibited any locality or the state legislature from enacting any future protections from gays and lesbians. So it was not just, it didn't just reverse the existing laws, it preempted any future action.
Well, how have ballot initiatives in this country affected the rights of gay men and lesbians in terms of their political power?
Well, for starters, there is no group in American society, and I would include in this undocumented aliens, who are probably a distant second. There is no group in American society who has been targeted by ballot initiatives more than gays and lesbians. The number of ballot initiative contests since the first one in the late 1970s is probably at above 200. Gays and lesbians lose 70% of the contests over other matters. They have essentially lost 100% of contests over same-sex marriage and now on adoption. The initiative process nationalizes issues because money and activism crosses state lines. So even if there is a local legislative majority to enact something for the protection of gays and lesbians, participation of people around the country can play a role in shaping a ballot process that would reverse it. The initiative process has been really the Waterloo of gay and lesbian politics.
We would like to display demonstrative number 4, which you can elaborate, but it lays out what I think you just said concerning ballot initiatives. But let me ask you this. What is it about gay and lesbian politics and ballot initiatives that has, in your view, your expert opinion, caused the ballot initiative process to be unleashed in this manner against that particular group?
Well, it's a hard question to answer. There is proponents and opponents of gay rights who would say that there is a culture war going on in the society. And as a consequence, these are things that people feel very deeply about, and it gets them hot under the collar. Initiative processes they are a mixed bag historically. On the one hand, they serve as a reasonable check on the behavior of legislator if the population is dissatisfied. On the other hand, they have been frequently been used to target minorities. And this is not just to say gays and lesbians, but no group has been more targeted than gays and lesbians. And I think from a political science standpoint, what we would think about is sort of expanding the scope of conflict. That if your side is not doing well in the legislature, perhaps because of the partisan distribution, then you try to move the arena of contestation to the populace, where you can motivate people through, campaign commercials, you inflame momentary passions.
In your expert opinion, does the ballot initiative process put the gay and lesbian community at a particular disadvantage in the political process?
I would say yes. First and foremost, because of the numbers. So in the end, the ballot initiative process is a plebiscite, and you need votes. You need notes. You need 50% plus one. The ballot initiative process in California is particularly problematic in part because we allow the amending of the state constitution with a simple majority, and in part because we really widely vary rates of turnout between, say, ballot initiative contests and the contest that would produce a state legislator. So that the state legislative distribution looks a lot more like the underlying population than a turnout in the statewide election. And of course, this allows money and organizations to transcend state lines. So it moves the focus of the contest away from the state politics alone and into a national arena.
Well, how many ballot initiatives have been passed relating to marriage between individuals of the same gender in the last decade?
I believe 33 or 34. Because in one state it failed, and then they came back in the next election and passed it, and that was Arizona.
Well, you mentioned that there have been other examples of the use of ballot initiatives against minority groups. You mentioned Romer. Could you give us a couple of other examples relating to other groups?
Sure. In the 1960s, there was an attempt to overturn the implementation of the Fair Housing Act in California by having a statewide ballot initiative saying that landlords and property owners could rent or sell to whomever they wanted, even if that was discriminatory in its practice. There have been a whole host of ballot initiatives targeting immigrants, and in some instances targeting more than immigrants. Prop 187 would be an example of that.
What happened to Prop 187?
Pardon me. Well, Prop 187, as I understand, was struck down at the lower court level, and the state declined to appeal that ruling. Prop 187 was really contentious because the language of the initiative was that state employees could withhold state services from any person they suspected of being an undocumented immigrant. But the basis of that suspicion was not particularly clear in the legislation. Latino activists in the state felt that that would create essentially open season on Latinos. That, if you walk in with a Spanish accent or with dark skin, that would be the basis for a state employee withholding state services from you until you could prove otherwise.
And what happened to the fair housing, the housing proposition that you mentioned from the 1960s?
It was struck down.
Now, is there an effect on the ability of gay men and lesbians to achieve political power based on the fact that they find themselves fighting these ballot initiatives?
I would say there are two effects, one of which is obvious and one of which is maybe less obvious. The obvious effect is that legislative gains that are, hard-earned, get overturned, and in some instances, gays and lesbians find themselves, even in the events where they win, contesting the same issue over and over again and spending a lot of resources on this. I think that the less visible effect is that it chills legislators. Legislators thinking about passing some statute that would be advantageous to gays and lesbians think twice about that, because no legislator relishes being overturned by a plebiscite.
How does the fact that ballot issues can be used to amend state constitutions affect the political power of gay men and lesbians?
The amendment process in many states, in fact, in most states, require that the vote of people take place. So even where the case that every elected official in California decided that Prop 8 were a bad idea, there is frankly nothing they can do to change it unless there is a vote of the people.
Well, are gays and lesbians underrepresented in political offices in the United States?
They are. At last count, only 6 people have ever served in the House of Representatives who have been openly gay, and only 2 of those were elected as openly gay. So in the other 4 instances, their sexuality became a matter of public record after their initial election. There has never been an openly gay senator or cabinet member, or certainly, president. There is only about 1% of the state's legislature that are gay, and even smaller, much smaller percentage of local elected officials.
Do you recall the percentage of local officials?
I believe it's 0.05%.
How about state? Total state legislatures, what is the percentage?
I think it's around 1%.
Thank you. Now, in your view, how does the low number of office holders who are gay and lesbians affect the political power or powerlessness of gay men and lesbians in the United States?
So, in political science, we call the election of a representative who shares the demographic characteristics of their constituents' descriptive representations. Theorists who have examined descriptive representation identify 2 effects. The first effect is that there is the direct representation, that having a gay man or lesbian sitting at the legislative table debating a particular issue, working out the policy, increases their voice. They are able to have their wishes at least considered in the process or whatever. And the second is that the presence of, and less clear, is that the presence of gay men or lesbians in public office, or for that matter, racial and ethnic minorities or any other group, really serves to constrain some of the bad behavior of other members of the legislature. There is a famous case where when Senator Mosley Brown was representing Illinois in the Senate, where the Senate kind of voted on, without comment, reauthorizing the U.S. The congressional resolution creating the Daughters of the Confederacy, and this just kind of swept through without any discussion. And Carol Mosley Brown went down to the well of the Senate and gave an impassioned speech about what they felt like and what that looked like to African Americans. And the Senate promptly reversed themselves as a consequence of her presence. And at that time, she was the only African member of the body. So having someone from the group certainly directly represents their voices, but also it makes others a little less willing to engage in some thoughtless or disparaging behavior.
So how does the lack of participation or representation in high-ranking and other government positions undermine political power of gay men and lesbians?
Well, for starters, in many parts of the country, elected officials have absolutely no problem speaking about gays and lesbians in a way that you could not imagine them speaking about any other member of the electorate. So in addition to gay and lesbian concerns not being considered meaningfully, for example, in the U.S. Senate, there are members of the United States Senate who, in public speeches, have compared same-sex marriage to marrying a box turtle. There is a member of the Senate who has a hold on a judicial nomination because of the nominee attended a lesbian commitment ceremony. Senator Coburn has gone on record saying that the gay and lesbian agenda is the greatest threat to freedom in the United States today. And a senator from South Carolina, when he was elected to the state Senate during the course of his campaign, that gays and lesbians shouldn't be allowed to teach in public schools. It's difficult to imagine an elected official saying such a thing about really almost any other citizen group in the United States.
Well, is the fact that some political officials feel so free to publicly denounce gay men and lesbians a factor that contributes to the lack of political power of that group?
Absolutely. And again, I think it plays out in multiple ways. First, this demonstrates a real hostility of that legislator, or perhaps his party, to the interests of gays and lesbians. But secondly, when someone in a position of authority communicates to you that this is okay, then it moves those thoughts into mainstream. So if two U.S. senators compare same-sex marriage to bestiality, that makes that part of mainstream conversation. That's not the fringe. That's a United States senator, and as a consequence, it legitimizes some of these deeply hostile beliefs.
Can you provide us with another example of a factor that contributes to the political powerlessness of gay men and lesbians?
Well, the simplest one would be their numbers. There just simply aren't enough gays and lesbians in any jurisdiction of any size to shape outcomes.
Do the attributes of other people towards gay men and lesbians affect their political power?
I think that the role of prejudice is profound. So when we are engaged in the pluralist struggle, as Dahl and others envisioned it, we are engaged in a contest of ideas where I'm trying to persuade you of the rightness of my position, and you are trying to persuade me of the rightness of your position. But if the group is envisioned as being somehow or another morally inferior, a threat to children, a threat to freedom, if there's these deeply seated beliefs, then the range of compromise is dramatically limited. It's very difficult to engage in the give and take of the legislative process when I think you are inherently a bad person. That's just not the basis for compromise and negotiation in the political process.
Did Dr. Nathanson's testimony that was played in court about the prejudice and hostility towards gay men and lesbians affect your view on this issue concerning political power?
It was consistent with my view in that I felt like it was agreeing with the position that I would take, that there is a lot of hostility to gays and lesbians. It is still the case, even today, that a majority of Americans find sex between two persons of the same gender to be morally unacceptable in all cases. Another huge percentage finds it morally unacceptable in most cases. So I think he sort of validated the belief that I had based on my examination of the data in the literature.
I would like to display demonstrative number 6, which you prepared based on your report and deposition, and ask you some questions about what political scientists call a feeling thermometer.
Okay.
And I resisted the temptation to use a thermometer graphic, Your Honor. What in your field is a feeling thermometer?
So a feeling thermometer is a simple question that we can ask respondents, and it's an unobtrusive measure of sentiment. So I ask you, on a scale from 0 to 100, how warmly do you feel about evangelical Christians? How warmly do you feel about African Americans? How warmly do you feel about Democrats, about Republicans, etc.? And could you put any group, and you could put any group in. What's nice about a feeling thermometer is because we don't, they don't know, we are not asking them to compare. Do you like one group better than the other? People are going to give us fairly honest answers. They might bias those answers upward. People tend to say they feel warmly about everybody, which is, I guess, nice to see, but a little dubious. But they can say they feel warmly, but if they are still between groups, group differences, we are identifying sort of differences in attitudes by the general public across different groups.
In connection with your work on this case, did you study opinion data relating to this sort of this feeling thermometer analysis?
I did.
What conclusions did you reach based on your analysis of that data concerning the political power of gay men and lesbians?
The conclusion I reached is that the American public is not very fond of gays and lesbians. So on a scale from 0 to 100, almost every group you can imagine that had any demographic identity, that would be the source of contestation. So religion, race, and ethnicity were scoring in the upper 60s. So people were giving them a score somewhere between 63 and 69. And every group has its haters. And it turns out that for African American and Hispanics, Catholics and Jews, some number of people placed the group below the midpoint, below the 50 score, between the third and, say, 45%. For gays and lesbians, instead of the mean score establishing between 65 and 70, the mean score was 49.4. So it was as much as 16 to 20 points below the average score for these other groups about whom we know there is already some amount of societal distance. So, you know, Hispanics and African Americans are held in a higher esteem than gays and lesbians. And over 65% of the respondents placed gays and lesbians below the midpoint, below the score of 50, whereas only, again, a third to 45% did the same for other groups.
Well, do you think that those numbers and those measurements had anything to do about the ballot initiatives that have been put on the ballot in so many states in recent years?
I do. And I think that it speaks to the larger question of the variation of opinion across the states and how that may affect my notion of political power. So when you see that approximately 2/3 of all respondents are giving gays and lesbians a score below 50, that's telling elected officials that they can say bad things about gays and lesbians, and that could be politically advantageous to them. Indeed, many parts of the electorate feel the same way. It's also suggesting that the initiative process could be fertile ground to try to mobilize some of these voters to the polls for that cause and for other causes. So similarly, we find, for example, that about half of all people think that sex between two people is morally wrong. But in some states, that number would be a lot higher. And so you could use that as a place to target gays and lesbians.
And do you believe that the views of major religious denominations have an effect on the political power of gay men and lesbians in this country?
I do.
What is your view?
I think that religion is the chief obstacle for gay and lesbian political progress. And it's the chief obstacle for a couple of reasons. The first is that after government, it's difficult to think of a more powerful society, a social entity in American society than the church. Religion is something that deeply connects to people's lives. Indeed, America is a very church-going nation compared with other Western democracies. It provides the opportunity for people to meet, together together on a weekly basis. So it's a very powerful organization, and in large measure, they are arrayed against the interests of gays and lesbians. Pardon me. There are exceptions, but in large measures, they are arrayed against gays and lesbians. This is an important contrast with African Americans, because except for the Southern Baptist Church, virtually every denomination was supportive of the civil rights movement at the time.
Do you recall Dr. Nathanson's testimony earlier this morning about religious organizations and their views on gay men and lesbians?
I do.
And did that affect your views in any way on this issue of the interaction between religious groups and gays and lesbians as it relates to political power?
It confirmed what I had previously believed, which is that biblical condemnation of homosexuality and the teaching that gays are morally inferior on a regular basis to a huge percentage of the public makes a political ground, the political opportunity structure very hostile to gay interests. It's very difficult to overcome that.
And are you aware, from your work in responding to Dr. Nathanson, that he's a professor of religious studies?
I don't believe he actually holds a professorial position anywhere.
That is his area of specialty in religious studies?
That's correct.
And did you also, do you recall, Professor, Dr. Young's testimony earlier this morning regarding the views of religious regarding the views of religious denominations in the United States as to gay men and lesbians?
I do.
And what is your understanding of Dr. Young's position?
I think Dr. Young freely admits that religious hostility to homosexuals is an important role in creating a social climate that's conducive to hateful acts, to opposition to their interest in the public sphere, and to prejudice and discrimination.
Can you point to any other situation in which religious groups in the United States have been so unified in their opposition to a particular minority social group?
I could not. A moment ago, I gave the example of the relatively high level of unity during the Black Civil Rights Movement in favor of the social group, but there is even an interesting piece of work that I relied on, in my opinion, by a scholar of religion and politics who suggested that opposition to homosexuality has been a real boost in the arm for the ecumenical movement, because it's something on which many different sects could agree. And so it served as the basis of cooperation between religious denominations.
Is violence against gay men and lesbians another factor that you believe, in your expert opinion, contributes to the lack of political power of that group?
It is.
Why is that?
So it's important to understand conceptually what we think of hate, what hate crime is. Okay. So a hate crime is distinguished from a simple assault in that it targets not just the individual who's being assaulted, but it's intended to send a message to the entire group. That's why there has to be extenuating circumstances to suggest that the person who was targeted for their identity. So if a gay man is beaten in a particular part of town, it's not just that he is the victim. The intended message is that you shouldn't be here in this part of town, or you shouldn't be engaging in the behavior in which you are engaging, or you are not supposed to have a public expression of self in the normal commerce of everyday life. Creates fear. It creates fear that really constrains or chills that what individuals would do in the normal daily activities of life. So it's designed to make you pull back, to make you less active. If you have a fear of violence, you are less likely to self-identify. If you have a fear of violence, you are less likely to go to a place where someone might see that by virtue of you being there, you actually are gay or lesbian. If there is violence, you might not know that if you go to a certain place, there is some chance that you will be hurt. I have known of individuals who simply don't leave a bar without two people because it's just not safe. In many parts of the country, it can be quite hazardous.
In your work on this case, did you study and review the FBI hate crime statistics that are now in evidence as plaintiffs' exhibits 489 through 494, covering the years 2003 through 2008?
I reviewed 2003 through 2007 for my report and deposition. The 2008 numbers had not been yet released when I was deposed.
Well, have you since reviewed the 2008 statistics?
I have.
Did you also review the Los Angeles hate crime report that has now been admitted as plaintiff's exhibit 834?
I did.
And when did you review that?
That too was released after my deposition. It was released in the latter part of last year.
With the court's permission, I would like to display demonstrative number 7 and ask you, Professor Segura, have hate crimes been on the increase or the decrease in the United States as directed against gay men and lesbians?
The data that I observed showed that over the last decade, there has been no real improvement, no real decline, and over the last 5 years, there actually has been an increase in violence directed towards gay men and lesbians.
And in 2008, we have those overt demonstrative. Was there an increase between 2007 and 2008 in hate crimes?
There was a substantial increase. And I would also point to the next column of figures, which is the share of all hate crimes. So what's happening is that gays and lesbians are representing a larger and larger portion of the number of acts of bias-motivated violence.
And when we talk about hate crimes, and when the FBI talks about hate crimes, what is your understanding in terms of the definition of a hate crime offense?
My understanding of a hate crime offense, as the FBI collects it, is that there has to be an underlying criminal offense on which there are exacerbating characteristics suggesting that the purpose of the offense was bias-related. So it's not just simply a shouting an epithet. It's shouting an epithet in association with an act of vandalism, or in association with a felonious assault, or in association with a robbery or something like that.
How did the hate crime figures for 2008 compare to the levels each year over the prior decade?
2008 is the highest, I think, for the last period of time, and represents a pretty substantial increase. I know that the numbers are also up in California and in Los Angeles County. It's also important to look at the intensity. So we don't want to look at just the number of crimes, but we want to look at the type of crimes. So one of the things the FBI does is it looks at what percentage of the hate crimes were violent as opposed to simply an act of vandalism. And it turns out that gays and lesbians are far more likely to experience violence. Like, I think the number is 73% of all hate crimes committed against gays and lesbians also include an act of violence. And in 2008, we're talking about the most extreme forms of hate-based violence, so rape and murder. 71% of all hate-motivated murders in the United States were of gay men and lesbians in 2008. 55% of all hate-motivated rapes were against gays and lesbians in 2008. There is simply no other person in society who endures the likelihood of being harmed as a consequence of their identity than a gay man or a lesbian.
I asked you about the Los Angeles data. I would like to have displayed Plaintiff's Exhibit 834 and ask you a few questions and have you turn to that exhibit in your binder. And that is the 2008 Los Angeles Hate Crimes Report.
Okay,
You have reviewed this document?
I have.
Correct. What does it tell you about the situation concerning hate crimes with respect to gay and lesbian individuals in Los Angeles?
Well, it tells me of a couple of things. So, I particularly took note of two items, and there are perhaps others. The first is that how many times on the basis of race, ethnicity, and national origin from 2007 to 2008 declined by 16%.
And what page are you looking at?
9.
Put page 9 on the screen. Thank you. Continue. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No problem. So there is a decline in racial and ethnic hate crimes, which I think is a good thing. But in the same period of time, there's an increase of 21% in bias-motivated crimes against gays and lesbians. So even if there is a sort of general negative drift overall, the drift for gays and lesbians is positive. The second thing I took note of was that on page 14, Los Angeles County documented a fair number of hate crimes specifically related to the Proposition 8 ballot initiative.
And what did the report conclude specifically?
That there were some number of crimes. I believe there were 9 acts of vandalism. There were a number of other smaller numbers of physical assaults associated with Proposition 8. These included acts of graffiti, the targeting of cars, etc.
Well, if you'll see at the bottom, it says, in addition, there were 4 violent crimes
I'm sorry?
at the,
Yes, 4 violent crimes. Yeah, that's the very last line.
I'd like you to turn to page 26, please. And perhaps you can describe what the report concludes here, and how that affects your views concerning political power of gay men and lesbians.
Well, so this reports the distribution of crimes by targeting people on the bias or the basis of a real or perceived sexual orientation. And it shows that in a couple of categories, the number declined. And in most of the categories, the numbers increased and increased sizably.
And were you in court yesterday during the testimony of Mayor Sanders from San Diego?
I was in the overflow room upstairs, yes.
Did you see the advertisement that was played during his testimony concerning alleged acts of violence, vandalism relating to Proposition 8 proponents?
I did.
Does that undermine your view that hate crimes and violence directed against gay men and lesbians is a factor that undermines, that detracts, that renders less the political power of gay men and lesbians?
I wasn't quite sure what to make of that video. On the one hand, let me state categorically, I think those sort of behaviors are unacceptable. And I would also state that as a political scientist, I am aware of, and there is a small literature on active vandalism, even in candidate-based elections. Electioneering activities are frequently not pleasant, tearing down of signs, etc. Notwithstanding, I thought it was interesting that their video certainly doesn't report any acts in the opposite direction. Acts of vandalism, as Mayor Sanders pointed out, even in front of his own house, the tearing down of Prop 8 signs, the 100 or more acts of violence against gays and lesbians during the course of 2008. That a more balanced way to look at what the effect of these behaviors would be to look at the effects from both sides. And obviously that was, not the interest of the advocates producing the video, but
Well, in your view, in the political world and in American society, is there pressure on gay men and lesbians to remain invisible to a certain extent?
certainly.
Remain visible,
Remain invisible.
invisible.
I think that sort of psychology of the closet and the social economic pressures of the closet are still quite relentless and insidious. They do vary dramatically across the country, and they do vary across racial and ethnic groups and across socioeconomic status. So for people who are in the sort of working class occupations, for people who are from the Deep South or the Great Plains states, self-identification as a gay man or a lesbian can be quite detrimental to one's health, one's income. There is still a profound incentive to not self-identify.
Well, how does that factor contribute in any way to the political powerlessness of gay men and lesbians, in your view?
For starters, if you can't self-identify, you are not really available for political mobilization. Any rational person would include that, you know. Even though I'm secretly gay or lesbian, I'm going to go to the Gay Rights March. That's not going to work out for them, because their attendance at the Gay Rights March would be at least an indicator to the public that perhaps you are a member of the community. So, if you are in the closet, you are unlikely to mobilize. If you are in the closet, it's difficult for you to even necessarily have information about what other gays and lesbians are doing. It's harder for gays and lesbians to find one another for political mobilization, particularly in places where their density is smaller. The other effect is that it creates a misperception in the public. So when the public sees gays and lesbians, what they see are gays and lesbians in major cities. And they conclude, gee, you know, there's a lot of gay activism, and there's, you know, all the gay men I have ever seen have advanced degrees and whatnot, when in fact that's something of a misperception, because it's the gays and lesbians you don't see that present the other side of that picture. People who, for economic necessity, or for physical safety, have not chosen to self-identify. So the public has a lower estimation of the total number of gays and lesbians. They have a misinformed estimation of the socioeconomic status of gays and lesbians. And I think they have a misperception of the quality of life or the level of social treatment of gays and lesbians. Not every gay man is Will from Will and Grace.